It was summer, in the year 627. The weather was warm and there was no ice along the coast of Iceland. Suddenly, small sails appeared over the horizon on the coast. These sails were not familiar to the Icelandic people, and it was unusual to see so many ships arriving at the same time to the sparsely populated island of Iceland. So the people of Iceland stayed and watched in curiosity as the ships approached. This would turn out to be a grave mistake, as the ships were planning to raid the coast, and the true target would not just be the meager wealth of these Icelandic people, but the Icelandic people themselves, as the true aim of this fleet was to capture slaves. They were slavers, and when they finally sailed south once again, after having raided the coast, they had killed entire villages, plundered them, and enslaved hundreds, leaving the locals traumatized and confused. The numbers, at least, was more than 400 people enslaved from one single town that had been raided. These slavers became described as the heathen scourge upon Iceland. Now, you might wonder, who were these slavers? These slavers were the Muslim Barbary pirates, who, despite the name pirates, were actually less of illegal outlaws and more professional fleets doing raids into enemy territory on behalf of various political entities and kingdoms coming from North Africa in what is modern-day Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia. Ships were sent out in order to do raids and collect booty and tribute. Previously, the Barbarypirates had usually been restricted to the areas of the Mediterranean Sea and its surroundings. However, more well-fortified cities and prepared defenses in the cities of the Mediterranean, together with more professionalized Mediterranean fleets, had made many of the Barbary states send their fleets further up north, especially as coast cities and trading ships in northern Europe were often less prepared for slave raids than in the Mediterranean. And though these slave raids were justified as a sort of jihad against the unbelievers in the north, as a way to damage the unbelievers. Allahu Akbar! Yazid sanastabihim! Alaqallakum al-Hamas! But the true fact of the matter is that slavery was particularly profitable in comparison to other ventures, and many of the North African raiders sent out from the North African coast targeted densely packed ships with passengers and traders for their human cargo, rather than their economic cargo in the North Atlantic Sea. And the same was true with cities and villages along the coast in northern Europe. They would regularly take slaves from as far away as the British Isles and return to slave ports along the southern coastline of the Mediterranean. For the Barbary pirates, coastal raids were preferred over attacking ships in northern Europe, even though towns usually were more heavily defended and had more people to defend them than singular ships. They were still a better target, as women were significantly more valuable on the slave markets than men, and prisoners taken at sea mostly consisted of male sailors. Attacking towns was also easier to plan attacks upon, as towns, unlike ships, don't move, and the coastal cities and towns in northern Europe were often less prepared for slave raids than in the Mediterranean. Thus, they were a very fine target, especially as fair-skinned women also fetched an even higher price due to their exotic features, about 2 to 3 times more, and sometimes much higher, and especially high if one of the captured women were from a noble family, and you could ransom them back to their families for a high price. For example, an attack at Fowey in Cornwall in 1645 resulted in the capture of 240 people, among them also some women of noble birth, whose price went so high that the English crown was forced to aid in the payment of the ransom. speaking about England and the British Isles. They were the most afflicted places in Northern Europe by these raids by the Barbary pirates. For example, the Barbarypirates raided so often and so severely that they depopulated entire villages in Ireland through slavery and slaughter, that certain villages sat abandoned for generations. And in a particularly violent 7-year period in the earliest days of the 17th century, England lost 466 ships to these pirates, a figure that equated to over 5 ships per month, year over year. Between 677 and 680, the English were losing 3,000 people to Muslim slavers per year, highlighting a problem that had not abated for the entirety of the century. While much fuss has been made about the pirates that stalked the shallows of the Caribbean, the barbaric pirates were actually a greater problem in terms of strength and in capturing people and ships that they attacked, at least in the beginning of the North Atlantic seafaring. And many North European kingdoms had to either pay tribute in advance in order to avoid getting attacked or raided by these Barbary fleets, or they had to pay ransom for people captured, either directly by the royal crowns or by relatives to those captured. Ransom for captured prisoners was actually so common that there almost existed a standardized procedure where one of the captives taken was sent away to their homeland in order to get the ransom for the other captives. One such person was Olafur Egilson, who was captured from Iceland in a raid in 627 that I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this video. In any case, Olafur Egilson was set free and tasked with returning to Scandinavia to find the founts for a group of slaves. And he returned to Vestmannaeyjar in Iceland in 628, but his wife, Asta Thorsteinsdottir, did not return until 637, and his children were never returned. And it is here it should be known that, despite this happening in another time, and Europeans being just as brutal in the New World as what happened here, the barbaric slavery still caused a lot of suffering and pain for those that were captured or had relatives that were captured. Another example of a person that suffered a lot despite being freed in the end was Guðríður Símonardóttir, who after capture and release became known as Tyrkia Gudda, Turkish heathen, and as the Turkish whore, due to having been sold for reasons. She was also accused of secretly having converted to Islam during her capture, in order to ease her treatment, though she herself denied this. Still, she was scorned for the rest of her life, which I intend to make a future video about. In any case, during the 17th century, it was hard to stop these Barbary raids and attacks upon ships. Some of these reasons were political. During this time period, many of the states of the North African coast were under the authority and the protection of the Ottoman Empire. During their early days in the 16th and 17th century, these states and their fleets were allowed to act with impunity because the overwhelming strength of the Ottomans defended them if they were to be attacked in any serious way. But it was also the case that the Ottomans did not have that much direct control over these states, kingdoms, and various political entities that existed in North Africa. For example, several times Swedish ships were attacked by the Barbary pirates. This despite the fact that the Ottomans were allied with the Swedish Empire at this time. And when the Swedish diplomats sent complaints to the Ottomans actually tried to exert pressure on the various Barbary factions, but they got rejected. and had to more or less go back to the Swedish diplomats and tell them that we are more or less sorry, but we don't have any control over this. Looking at the correspondence, I also kind of suspect that certain people that resented the Ottomans and their rule in North Africa actually doubled down on their piracy as an act of defiance against the Ottomans. You also had a problem with the fact that the Barbary pirates were not one faction, but several factions, all with their own politics and agendas. Some who even were directly opposed to the Ottomans. The Barbary piracy on Swedish ships was such a problem that during Charles XI's reign, Sweden sent a Portuguese Jew, Henrik Azeveda, in the year 667 on a mission by the Swedish government to accompany a Swedish crown ship that would visit all the Barbary states and all the various factions there, and if possible agree with their governments on trade relations and free sailing for Swedish ships. Henrik Azeveda was also to ransom the Swedish slaves who were in Barbarypirates or in the Barbary states. The maximum price was set at 300 Spanish piastres. However, neither this nor any similar attempt had any success in creating total freedom from the Barbary piracy, as the factions were too many and had two different agendas in order to be able to come to a diplomatic agreement with everyone. Many of these Barbary states would also go to war with each other, or with the Ottomans at times, meaning that those that paid tribute to some of the Barbary states would become the targets for those they did not pay tribute to, or just because they did pay tribute to their enemies. Another reason as to why this sort of piracy was hard to stop had to do with practical reasons. The pirate ships were often difficult to detect, as they often consisted of Western-built ships flying under false flag, that say they appeared as belonging to other political entities, rather than sailing with the flags that showed their true allegiance. And for merchant ships, they were in a very precarious situation, as trying to escape from these ships by the pirates before they were identified as pirates was risky, as if they turned out to not be pirates, they exposed themselves to being suspected of being smuggling boats if they tried to escape. Even when identified as pirate ships, those coming from Tunis and those coming from Algiers could not be distinguished from each other, or any other of the Barbary states, which presented difficulties, as England was often in conflict with one and allied with the other at the same time, a confusion which the pirates often exploited. And the same was true with Sweden, as Sweden was often allied with the Ottoman Empire, which in turn might favor one and not the other at the time. And then you have also the fact that many of these Barbary pirates were highly skilled sailors, and they usually operated in large fleets. Some who were large enough to outright challenge the fleets of other kingdoms in Europe. Thus it would not be an easy matter to fight them, especially in Northern Europe, where most of the northern kingdoms were inexperienced in fighting against the Barbary pirates, unlike the kingdoms found around the Mediterranean. These problems, both political and practical, made it hard to combat the Barbary piracy in Northern Europe, and consequently the Barbary pirates were a large problem up in Northern Europe during the 17th century. However, during the 18th century a lot changed, as better fleets with newer types of ships and fleet organization and organization of coastal defense made the Barbary pirates no longer become such a threat in the North Atlantic Sea. However, the Barbary pirates would remain in the Mediterranean until the 19th century and still be a threat there. But that is for another video. And I hope you found this video interesting and informative. If you have any questions or other comments about this or any future thing you would want me to do a video about, then post it. Please do subscribe as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.